Previously on Ty's Hot Mess History.
Enzo was never really into Madeline, and he wasn't too fond of her firstborn son either, calling the younger John Jacob a poor little rich boy. Though Madeline didn't leave her first son any money, she did leave him 2 pieces of her jewelry, a pearl necklace that was valued at just over $1,500 and a diamond solitaire ring that was worth over $50,000. I'd like to think that those pieces had sentimental value. She was almost always photographed wearing a 2-strand pearl necklace. Perhaps the ring was the one that John Jacob used to propose to her. That would have been touching if those were the 2 pieces that she was able to leave to her son. He was the baby who Madeline was carrying on the Titanic, who she named after his father. He was also John Jacob Astor, but he was also known as the Titanic baby. And even though he was born into wealth, he had a lot of troubles of his own. If you want to know the story of that little brat who was once labeled in a headline as the rich boy nobody wants, let me know in the comments section.
Well, you let me know, so we are here. I'm finally delivering it. This is a story about a rich boy who grew up to be a rich, miserable man. And if it weren't for his family's money, he'd have had no identity at all. He survived the sinking of the Titanic, in a way. His mother was a few months pregnant, carrying him, when she and her husband were on the Titanic, returning to America from their honeymoon in Egypt and Europe. She was Madeline Astor, the wife of John Jacob Astor IV, the richest passenger on the ship. Their son was John Jacob Astor VI, though he was also called the Titanic baby, and later on in his life, the rich boy nobody wants. He was wealthy and frankly not much else, but he was a flaming hot mess. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that thumbs up to support this video for free. Thank you. Now, on to why you are here. John Jacob Astor VI was an American socialite more than anything, and a businessman, arguably to a much lesser degree. He was the 3rd child of his father, John Jacob Astor IV, and the 1st child of his mother, Madeline Force Astor. His father never got to lay eyes on his son because he died a gentleman's death on the Titanic on April 15, 1912, seeing to it that his young teenage wife made it safely into a lifeboat. He reportedly helped many other women and children get into lifeboats and even went to the ship's kennel to release the dogs on board and gave them a fighting chance. 4 months later, almost exactly 4 months later, on August 14th, the young widow, Madeline Astor, gave birth to her baby boy, who was almost immediately dubbed the Titanic baby, John Jacob Astor VI. He weighed in at almost 8 pounds, a big boy born into big money. I can only imagine that his father thought that he had a second lease on life and was looking forward to returning home from his honeymoon with his new wife and starting the second chapter of his life. But that didn't stop him from having a will in place, in case the worst happened. And the worst did happen. But all was well. The Titanic baby slid out of his mom's uterus right into a $3 million fortune. His trust fund that J.J. Astor IV set up in his will for any spare kids that came along. It was definitely an afterthought and not anything specific like he had for Madeline or his daughter Ava. And the Titanic baby's measly $3 million trust was nothing like what his father had left for his older half-brother, Vincent. Because Vincent was left with almost all of his father's vast fortune of $85 million. All of their father's luxury mansions and hotels, and roughly $70 million went to Vincent. and that became a thorn in the Titanic baby's side as soon as he understood what money was, and it remained a problem for him well into his adult years, even after Vincent died. And speaking of Vincent, he was not present for the birth of his new brother, and his absence seemed to foreshadow what their relationship would become. Distant at best. Everything about young John Jacob was about money, and for the remainder of this video, I'll do my best to call him young John Jacob as a means of differentiating between his father, the fourth. I'll also refer to him as Jakey, which was the nickname that the press seemed to use for him most often. And while I'm on a tangent, this often comes up, so I'll address it concisely right now. If the father is John Jacob Astor IV, why is the son the sixth and not the fifth? Long story short, there was a branch of Astors who made a wonderful living for themselves in England, and John Jacob Astor, the first Baron Astor of Hever, was born before our young John Jacob of today's story, so he was officially the fifth, and the American was the sixth, another thorn in Jakey's side. Now, back to our story. On the day that he was born, Manhattan was in a frenzy. He was America's version of nobility. Manhattan was buzzing as though a new prince had been born. Police officers had to stand guard on the Astor's block and fight off crowds of people who were hoping to catch a glimpse of the newborn baby. But most of the talk about young John Jacob had to do with money. And in one of the very first news articles written about him on the very first day after his birth, there was a lot of discussion about his $3 million trust. Mainly a rumor that his grandparents on his mother's side wanted to contest the will of young John's father, because they didn't think that $3 million was enough for the boy. Mind you, we're talking $3 million in 1912, which today in 2023 has the buying power of about $94 million. Would that be enough for you? If that would not be enough money for you because you have substantially more, email me if you're looking for a girlfriend. Somewhere, a rumor was started that the will would be contested so that the Titanic baby would be given just as much money as his older half-brother, Vincent Astor. The story grew legs when the baby was given his father's full name at birth, the assumption being that his mother deliberately gave him that name to make her case stronger when it came time to contest the will. But according to his maternal grandfather, William Forrest, none of that was true. His words, quote, "The report that there will be a contest of Mr. Astor's will is all nonsense. All these reports of a contest are nonsense," end quote. So, $3 million was all that this poor baby was going to get, and it would have been the same if he'd been born a girl. That was just the amount that his father settled on for any additional children other than Ava, who received $10 million, and Vincent, who inherited the lion's share, $69 million. But only $3 million for his little half-brother, which was nothing special in the Astor family. And the Titanic baby himself would prove to be nothing special as he grew into adulthood. But at this point in his new life, there it was. $3 million was enough for the baby, until it wasn't. Which was around the time that he turned 4 years old. We'll get there. But in the meantime, his mother, Madeline Astor, had made her mourning plans public. The standard for an upper-class widow in this period was to publicly express her mourning through her clothing, and usually for a period of 2 years, in which she would wear black and other very dark-colored dresses, and jet black mourning jewelry, literally made from the mineral called jet. And Madeline did mourn her husband in this way for 2 years, retired from public life inside of the Astor Fifth Avenue mansion with her baby. And even though they weren't doing anything besides staying home, Madeline soon realized that the scheduled monthly withdrawals for the care of the young John Jacob would not be enough to cover his expenses. In November of 1912, Jakey was approaching the age of 3 months. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle had printed yet another article about his finances. This one laid out how his mother, as his financial guardian, would schedule yearly withdrawals for his day-to-day care, and how she planned to help him earn interest on the account so that he would have accrued a lot more additional interest until the trust was eventually turned over to his own care. She requested only $10,000 per year from his trust, saying that that amount would cover his needs. Now, I've never had a child, but that $10,000 in 1912 had the buying power of just over $315,000 today. Would that be enough for one of your children? Madeline only wanted the $10,000 per year for 3 years, after which she would support her son with her own money. Her goal was to allow her son's millions to collect interest so that he would have even more millions by the time that he reached the age of maturity. Specifically, she hoped that her plan would turn his $3 million into about $10 million by the time the boy turned 21. And I think that that's good looking out on her part. But his mother wasn't the only one who was looking out for him. In May of 1913, when the young Astor was only 9 months old, a tidal wave of presents for him landed at his Fifth Avenue mansion. The Titanic baby mania had taken over the world, and people from all over were sending him presents: infant wear, lace-lined bassinets and cribs. And I'm sure that it seemed like a kind, even if a little bit creepy, gesture to most people, except for the one secretary who had the duty of returning to sender each and every single item. I don't have an explanation for why this happened all of a sudden. It wasn't his birthday. The anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic had passed by this time, and I'm almost sure that invariably each of those presents came from people who were not as well off as the Astors, because practically everyone in the world had less money than the Astors. The next time little Jakey was discussed in the news, it was back to the money. This is when the public learned that $10,000 per year was in fact not enough to care for the Titanic baby. Truth be told, his mother had figured that out the second year of his life and had already increased his allowance from $10,000 per year to $20,000 per year, roughly $620,000 in today's money. But he didn't make the papers because the allowance increase had been exposed. He made the news because his mother realized that even $20,000 was not enough money to care for him on an annual basis, and she'd had to dig in her own pockets to loan her baby son $7,590 just so that his expenses for the previous year were in the clear. Now, in all fairness, I have to say that the young John Jacob had a number of expenses that most toddlers didn't have, and they included, but were not limited to, attorneys, a physician and a nurse, estate taxes, income taxes, and mansion maintenance expenses. Altogether, his yearly expenses were just over $27,000, and his mother went to court to request a little extra money from his trust to cover the cost of his care. This wasn't the only noteworthy moment in Jakey's life when he was 4. That same year, his mother married her second husband, the successful and sensible banker Carl Dick. This union gave the young John Jacob 2 younger half-brothers, William Jr. and John. They spent their days traveling from place to place: New York, Florida, Rhode Island, and Europe. From this point on, for most of his childhood, the young John Jacob was kept away from the press. His mother was so occupied with making her new blended family work that she no longer had the time to manage Jakey's trust, so she turned that over to his oldest half-brother, Vincent. During this time in his life, young John Jacob had a tutor who made it known that Jakey was not a bright student, nor, despite having a wealthy upbringing, did he possess any social charm. This tutor was James Noble Gifford, and he made these details about Jakey known in a tell-all book called Caviar for Breakfast, a book that used pseudonyms to talk about its subjects, but everyone knew that it was very clear that he was writing about Jakey. James Gifford had tutored many wealthy students, but several chapters in his book were dedicated to a student named Jack, who he described as the best-known boy in the world. He wrote that the boy had very expensive taste, loved caviar for breakfast, and refused to ride in any car except his own because other vehicles were too common. He also threw in an anecdote about the boy only riding the elevator in his house to get from one level to the next. Even if the elevator was broken, he'd wait for it to be repaired before he took the stairs up or down. Side note about James Noble Gifford: the proximity that he gained to New York's wealthy as a tutor was something that he used against the elite in novel after novel. He wrote a number of books in the 1930s, all exposing the extremely rich for being extremely lazy and lacking morality. And the novels seemed to sell really well. So I made a video about how a lot of wealthy white people who lived during the Gilded Age funded the construction of a lot of buildings at historically black universities. At the end of that video, I mentioned that the name Astor is on a building at the St. George School in Rhode Island, near Newport. At that time, I knew that Vincent Astor had donated money to the school, but I didn't know that Jakey Astor had also attended the school, and boy oh boy was he unpopular. If this school had those fun yearbook categories, he would have been voted least likely to succeed and most likely to be an ass. Even though the things that his former tutor had written about him seemed to be mean, they also seemed to have a ring of truth when compared to what his classmates said about him. By the time Jakey was a teenager, his high society peers would talk behind his back about his extreme arrogance and horrible manners. They said that he was never at the top of his class and went about his schooling as though he didn't care about it. And he didn't. It wasn't like he needed a good education so that he could get a good job. He was born into more money than he'd ever need. So he put little effort into his expensive education, so little that he didn't even finish that school. He wasn't really interested in getting into college or pursuing a career. His interests were cars and movies. School was just a place for him to brag about being the only living John Jacob Astor, and he would do that, literally, even though it wasn't true that he was the only living John Jacob Astor. The fifth had been born before him, 26 years before him, and was living as a true gentleman with a title and everything in England. And while Jakey was bragging about being the only living John Jacob Astor, J.J. Astor V was alive and well on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and didn't die until 1971. Now, there was some point when Jakey was a teenager that he had another major life change. Madeline, his mother, had pretty much given up on him after she said that he had a governess who had turned him against everyone and everything. And during these years, before he reached the age of majority, it seems like maybe from the time of 16 or so, he lived on his own, without any parents or guardians, at an apartment in the Savoy Plaza. In 1932, when young Jacob was 20, he tried his hand at love. He was on a vacation in Italy where he met a young woman his same age. Her name was Donna Cristina Torlonia. She was reported to be a beauty, a statuesque blonde with blue eyes. They saw each other often and were seen out and about and having fun for his whole trip. Then, suddenly, it was announced that they were engaged to be married. Apparently, Jakey and Donna had not only gotten engaged, but they started planning their wedding because the news got leaked by a friend of Donna's who said that she was going to be a bridesmaid. Now, this was 1932, a time when people generally did not enter into marriage as lightly as many do today, and people as young as Jakey and Donna from wealthy families certainly would have had many discussions before planning what would have been a big society wedding. He just proposed without asking her parents, and there was no chance in hell that that was going to work, even if he was an Astor. Donna's mother told the papers that the whole idea was absurd, and Jakey, who thought that his name and money meant everything in the world, was left in disbelief, not understanding why the Torlonias wouldn't jump at the chance to welcome him as their son-in-law. Well, believe it or not, that would not be the last time that young John Jacob would try to marry a girl without her parents' permission and get rejected. He also tried unsuccessfully to rush a Susie Hopkins and a LeBrun Kruger Rhinelander down the aisle with him. But on his 21st birthday, he was officially a man, and he received his trust money. The $3 million had grown to at least $5 million, about $118 million today, and he could do whatever he wanted to do with it, but it was likely closer to $10 million. The true amount was never disclosed to the press. Now he finally possessed the money that was the only thing that had ever made him newsworthy. Being a rich baby turned rich kid and now rich young adult seemed to be his only identity. Nobody ever said that he was smart or cute or charming or kind. Well, there was Big. He was called Big in his birth announcements, but other than that, he was just the rich Titanic kid who also had a reputation for being a snob. And now he was the rich Titanic adult, able to make of his life whatever he wanted. And even he went on continuing to make his money his identity. One of his first purchases was a yellow Rolls-Royce that seemed to be his favorite car. It wouldn't take long before he'd have an entire fleet of about 10 luxury automobiles. His mother's third husband said Jakey would drive each one every day, as if they were horses that needed to be exercised for a while. Jakey also used a private railroad car to get to longer distances, though sometimes he was known to hire a private railroad car to take himself and his friends just on short distance trips that anyone else would have just taken by car. If there was a way that he could spend $1,000 instead of $100, he'd choose the $1,000 route every single time. In addition to getting his hands on his money, another big change came for Jakey when he turned 21. His mother divorced her second husband, which was the only father Jakey had ever known. She ditched him for Italian boxer Enzo Fioramonte, who was only a few years older than Jakey. And the young John Jacob didn't like this match at all, and he was very vocal about it. I have told that couple's story on this channel, and I have to say, I agree with Jakey 100% on this one. Enzo and his mother were not a good match. I won't go into all of the details here, but I'll say this. She was emotionally and financially abusive to him, and he was physically abusive to her. Now, as I was saying, Jakey didn't like this relationship with his mother and the boxer, and I completely understand why. But perhaps he could have navigated that situation more smoothly if he hadn't made his opinion known through snarky quotes to newspaper writers. He had to have known that that would embarrass his mother. The boxer, by the way, was the one who had made the comment about all of Jakey's luxury cars, saying that they were a bit overboard and basically suggesting that Jakey's obsession with them was unnatural. That's true, but that also could have come from a place of jealousy because the boxer himself had no problem at all spending his wife's money on expensive items for himself. But that was Madeline's problem. That was her wedding. The young John Jacob would soon be making his own wedding plans. At the age of 21, he was officially available for marriage, and his fortune made him one of the most eligible bachelors in the world. But even with his massive fortune, and being a member of one of the most distinguished families in the country, the mothers and fathers of his society group were eager to pass on the chance of becoming his in-law and subjecting their debutantes to marriage with him. In 1934, he found a girl who was willing to take the challenge when New York socialite Eileen Gillespie said yes to his marriage proposal. The pair had been dating for a while and things seemed to be going well. They were planning a grand wedding. Everything was set, even the date, February 6, 1934. Then, Jakey started being Jakey. According to relatives of both families, Jakey was rude and sarcastic to Eileen's parents. Also, they were rather conservative and didn't approve of Jakey's flashy lifestyle and wild spending. Even though he was a grown man, he was said to have conducted himself like a petulant child. The Gillespies didn't approve of his, quote, fits of temperament, fickleness, jealousy, or his unstable and extravagant tastes, end quote. Then there was also the reported argument over the amount of Eileen's dowry. It seems that after the families had settled on an amount, Jakey wanted more. Eileen's parents had had enough. They tried to convince their daughter to move on from the Titanic baby. Here's a quote that Mrs. Gillespie gave to the Daily News in February of 1934. Quote, although her views and mine have been divided, at the present time we are absolutely in accord. I'm glad that I was able to open my daughter's eyes in time, end quote. And with that, the Lawrence Lewis Gillespies officially called off the wedding on January 22nd, just 2 weeks before their daughter was supposed to walk down the aisle. This cancellation surprised no one in high society except Jakey. He was so proud of his family name and fortune that it was inconceivable to him that debutantes weren't lining up at the chance to become the next Mrs. Astor by marriage to him. In the story about Jakey, the Daily News called The Rich Boy Nobody Wants, this was what they printed about young John Jacob's love for his money and family name. Quote, just how much money Jack has is probably known only to Jack, his closest relatives, bankers, and lawyers. But just how much family he has is known by a great many people in the world. And just how orally proud he is of that fortune and name is known by practically everyone in his social sphere. End quote. The people around Jakey were fed up with his bragging. All of the things that he bragged about having, they had. They were in his social circle, and they were all there for the same reason, mainly that they all had ridiculous amounts of wealth. But Jakey thought that somehow his money made him more special. Perhaps it was this love of money and the status that he thought it gave him that made the young John Jacob resent his older brother, Vincent Astor, so much. And don't get it wrong, Vincent was no fan of Jakey. But while Jakey was bragging about having money, Vincent was busy making money for himself and his entire family. He kept to himself. Vincent married more than once, and neither he nor his wives enjoyed being in the public eye. He was a private person who liked to do good for his family and his city, out of the spotlight. He took his role as head of the Astor family and fortune very seriously. So when Jakey's mother asked him to take charge of Jakey's finances, he did, and he took that seriously too. Vincent seemed to put family ahead of everything. He was never a fan of Jakey's mother. Recall that when John Jacob Astor IV married her, she was only 18 and so was Vincent. But Vincent loved his father, so he accepted his father's wife. And while many reports say that Jakey's $3 million fortune grew to $5 million under Vincent's charge, several reports, like this one in the Daily News, say that Vincent actually increased his little brother's trust to somewhere around $10 million. But whether it was actually 5 or 10 million, it wasn't enough for John Jacob, and he wanted half of the money that was left to Vincent. The family knew how bitter he was, but the public and his elite social circle only saw the side of him that was constantly showing off, bragging, and spending like crazy. Because he never developed a personality, his hope was that material things would attract women to him. So, in an effort to prove himself as husband-worthy material for Eileen Gillespie, he purchased, quote, a colossal townhouse and an equally huge Newport place for the girl he hoped to make his bride, end quote. In the late 1800s, Newport, Rhode Island became the place where wealthy New Yorkers bought summer homes. That's why he purchased a place there too. But again, the huge homes would not be enough for the Gillespies to turn their daughter over into young Jacob's hands. Quick side note regarding the passing down of fortunes in the Astor family. This is one of the reasons that I love sharing these old news articles with you, because they give us a pretty unfiltered look at how people thought and talked back then, long before the days of political correctness, and I like that. So, the first John Jacob Astor had several daughters and 2 sons. They were John Jacob II and William Backhouse Astor. When the father died, he had a $20 million fortune, and he left most of it to William. John Jacob II was left only $10,000 because he was an idiot. Now, when they used the word idiot during his lifetime, they meant someone who had an intellectual disability. But I think that it's a little ironic that 3 generations later, the world sees another John Jacob give most of his money to the son who was not an idiot. And I mean idiot the way that we use that term today, like a fool or a moron. Anyway, this is how that long news story called The Rich Boy Nobody Wants ended. First, with a quote from a friend of the Gillespies, Mrs. Bruce Metcalf, and she was diplomatic about it. This is how the entire ending reads, quote, and Mrs. Bruce Metcalf, a friend of the Gillespies, is quoted as saying, I think the whole thing was a blessing. The young couple were not mated. They would never have been happy. How splendid that they found out in time. Now that's the end of her quote. Then it goes on to read, and the 5th John Jacob Astor is still the boy nobody wants. End quote. Now eventually, the young John Jacob did get married. And when somebody finally did want the boy, it was a bit of a scandal because she was a very close friend of Eileen Gillespie, his ex-fiancée. He settled on a girl named Ellen Tucky French. And this little hussy was so close to Eileen that she was going to be a bridesmaid in her wedding. Well, guess what? She had been attracted to little Jakey the whole time that Eileen was dating him, when he proposed to Eileen, when he was making wedding plans with Eileen, when he bought not 1, but 2 humongous houses for Eileen to share with her in holy matrimony. This friend stood by Eileen and helped her pick out wedding colors and wedding reception food and a wedding cake. She probably went with her to try on dresses and told Eileen that all the ugly dresses were actually pretty. But here's the thing. Jakey's heart was still with Eileen. Nobody even thought that that little rascal had a heart, but he was heartbroken over losing Eileen. He left the country and went to Shanghai to grieve the relationship. Even months later, he said that he would still be willing to marry her. Now, we all know that he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He still didn't really seem to understand that he was the one who had been dumped, so it didn't matter that he was still willing to marry her, but nevertheless, weeks after returning to New York, he proposed to Ellen French. Of course, she said yes, old nasty hussy, and you can't tell me that nasty Jakey got with Ellen for any other reason but to try to get under Eileen's skin. He would have married one of her friends regardless, because he was just that spiteful. But tell me this, do Do you think that part of Ellen's appeal to him was that her name was so close to Eileen? So, if he were to call out the wrong name in the throes of passion, he could just try to cover it up. But I must admit, this guy doesn't exactly give me the throes of passion, fun in the sack vibes. He seemed like he would want to hurry up and rush his time in bed so that he could go spend time with his one true love, his money. Anyway, Jakey and Ellen got married on June 30th, 1934. And don't they look happy? They had one child, a boy named William Backhouse Astor III. And I'm surprised that the Astors didn't retire the name Backhouse. So you know that Jakey and Vincent Astor are the grandchildren of Caroline Astor, the Gilded Age Queen of High Society. Well, she made her husband refer to himself as William B. Astor because she thought that Backhouse sounded too much like outhouse. So that was just a thought in my head. Young John Jacob went on to get married a total of 4 times in his life. And believe it or not, it wouldn't be the women in his life that proved to be the bane of his existence. Because you know how horrible wives can be, right, fellas? Ha ha ha. Just kidding, ladies. His biggest problem seemed to be wills that left him with scrawny inheritances. Not getting enough money when his closest family members passed away. First, there was his dad, who had the nerve to only leave him a measly $3 million after dying on the Titanic. Then, when his mother passed away, with about $1.5 million to her name, that money went to his younger half-brothers that she had with her second husband. His mom, at that point, figured that Jakey should have been good for money for the rest of his life. So all that she left him was a diamond solitaire ring and a 2-strand pearl necklace that wasn't worth a lot. I mean, if he were to have pawned that necklace, he wouldn't even have had enough money to buy one Rolls Royce. Sheesh. But then there was Vincent, his big brother. Jakey never let it go that Vincent got practically all of their father's money after he died. And even after Vincent died, he still pursued that $70 million that their father left to Vincent. And he got downright nasty about it. Now again, Vincent never liked young John Jacob. All that he did for him was because he was dutiful to his family. Vincent loved his father so much that he honored his father's wife. But truth be told, he never liked Madeline. He never respected Madeline. And therefore, when she gave birth to Jakey, Vincent didn't even believe that Jakey was a biological Astor, and he did not recognize him as such. But he still performed his duty as guardian over his brother's trust and grew the money. Jakey would never have as much money as Vincent, but Vincent saw to it that Jakey was set for life. And how did Jakey repay his brother? By suing Vincent's wife after Vincent died and trying to smear his brother's name posthumously. Here's the story. Vincent's health was failing him badly in 1958. He was hospitalized for a good part of that year. His wife, Brooke, would sometimes bring him alcohol to help him deal with his pain. The alcohol didn't do much except provide him temporary pain relief, for his death was right around the corner. Vincent Astor passed away on February 3rd, 1959, at the age of 67. He died of a heart attack. But months before he passed, in June of 1958, he revised and signed a new will that left Jakey absolutely nothing. By this time, Vincent had grown his fortune to $120 million, and he left half of it to his wife for her living expenses so that she could maintain the luxurious lifestyle she had when Vincent was alive. The other half went to the charitable foundation that the couple managed, the Vincent Astor Foundation. And Jakey, never having been too smart in math, said, Okay, his wife got half, his charity got half. Now where's my half? Okay, he didn't really say that, but he did come looking for the money that he always thought was his. Brooke hadn't even been able to get out of her mourning clothes before she found out that she was being sued by her dead husband's brother. That was bad enough, but what the young John Jacob told the press was even worse. Vincent Astor had always maintained a stellar reputation. Everyone saw him as an upright man. He was admired in high society circles, but he was the first Astor who was admired outside of those circles because he had a heart for the people in his city. He was the first Astor to take on philanthropic causes in any major way, and people remembered him that way. But Jakey told the press that his brother had left him out of his will because he was mentally ill, a senile alcoholic whose wife had been feeding him so much booze that when the time came for him to make his will, he was too insane to know what he was doing. He was trying to do to Vincent in death what he never could have done to him in life, attempt to ruin his image. Now, when Vincent's name appeared in the press, it was alongside words like mentally incompetent and deranged. Come on now, Jakey. Well before your brother got sick and was in his fully right state of mind, we all know that he was never a fan of yours and that the whole world would have expected Vincent to not acknowledge Jakey in his will. Brooke made it abundantly clear that Vincent was of sound mind and knew exactly what he was doing when he made his final will. And nobody was on Jakey's side, not even the press. Newsday hit him with a fat joke writing, quote, Vincent Astor, who died last February 3rd at the age of 67, left a fortune of between $100 million and $200 million, but not a cent of it to his portly younger half-brother. End quote. This portly prick was now 47 years old, jealous of his dead brother and still wanting money that never belonged to him. Instead of joining his sister-in-law to share in the grieving process, he'd made himself a burden on this heartbroken woman. But that was Jakey, always putting himself first and his love of money as a very close second. He whined that Vincent had a legal right, but not a moral right to keep all of the money. Well, once again, showing that he was not too bright, as he was suing in a court of law, not a court of morals. He accused Brooke of giving his brother alcohol to influence him to leave him out of the will. But anyone who knew even half of the story knew that on a sober day, Vincent would have made the same decision. He didn't need anything to influence him to tell his little brother to take a hike. Thankfully, the court did not agree with Jakey. Brooke Astor settled and gave her sorry-ass brother-in-law $250,000, probably just enough to really piss him off, and that was that. And she went on to give away those millions of dollars to charity and did so much good in the world because of it, just like she and her husband had always done. What a waste it would have been to have given that kind of money to a selfish person like Jakey. The Titanic baby died in Miami Beach in 1992. He was 79 years old. He was survived by his younger brother from his mom's second marriage, his daughter, son, and 3 grandchildren. One of them, Gregory Todd Astor, played Colonel Astor in Titanic the Musical in 2012, 100 years after the Titanic sank. Jakey's death was not remarked upon in any grand way, but that was probably the fairest reflection upon his life. He was not grand. He hadn't done anything but been born into wealth. Just months before Jakey died, his daughter, Jackie Astor, made a statement that might have humanized Jakey in some people's eyes. She said, quote, "It was all so sad and tragic for his mother and the whole family. You know, his parents were very much in love, and I think the memory of it all has affected his whole life. Why can't people just forget the Titanic?" End quote. Why can't we forget the Titanic? I know that for me, the answer is that ultimately, Titanic is a story about lives way more than the ship itself. I think of all of those people, and even their pets, being excited, nervous, looking forward to their next adventure that so many of them never got to see. I don't think that Titanic will ever be forgotten. So many people remember it for so many different reasons. As a matter of fact, this story is basically a spin-off of 2 other Titanic stories that I published on my channel a while ago. The first story of John Jacob Astor IV and his wife Madeline, Jakey's parents. Then I published the long saga of Madeline's 3rd marriage to the physically abusive Italian boxer. In that video, I asked you if you wanted me to make this video, and a lot of you did. But in case you're new here, hello, and you might want to check out those 2 videos. I'll leave links to them in the description box. I see them as prequels to this one. The young John Jacob Astor wasn't the only child of a millionaire who was careless with his money. Eulalia Walker was the daughter of the woman who is widely known as America's first black millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker, who made her fortune in hair care with a product line and salons. She left 1/3 of her estate to her daughter, and many would say that Eulalia squandered the money away. I published a video about that story that you can see here. I'll also leave a link to it in the description box. My sources for this story are the Buffalo Courier Archives, 1912, Shadow of the Titanic by Andrew Wilson, the Buffalo Inquirer Archives, 1912 and 1916, the Detroit Free Press Archives, 1992, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives, 1912, 1934, and 1940, the Buffalo Times Archives, 1913, Newsday Suffolk Archives, 1959, and the Boston Globe Archives, 1932. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the Hot Mess History. The link is in the description box.